When we see a historic battlefield preserved, there is a story about how that land remains preserved and undeveloped. What happened at Newmarket? How did portions of this battlefield get preserved? That's what we're going to discuss in today's video. I'm Sarah K. Byerly with Gazette 66.5, and today I'd like to introduce you to the preservation history and current preservation efforts that are happening or happened in the past at Newmarket, Virginia. As I mentioned in my previous video, Newmarket had a lot of interest in the post-war era. Veterans came back. There were several ceremonies when monuments or markers were unveiled. There were parades that happened. There were Civil War reunions or veteran reunions that took place at Newmarket. People came by the hundreds, by the thousands, to see this town, to see this battlefield. And this would be happening from in the 1890s into the early 20th century. And that played a role in Newmarket's early preservation. If people are coming to see an area, you probably don't want to build it up with a bunch of houses. Also, it helped that the town of Newmarket stayed relatively small in the passing decades, leaving a lot of the land in the area undeveloped. But what happened as we moved farther into the 20th century and the men and boys who had fought at the battle on May 15, 1864, passed away? What happened when they were no longer coming to see this land or to take part in reunions? Some of the story centers around the Bushong family. And we've talked a lot about the family, we've talked about their property, even down to the topography of their farm, because the Bushong farm sits at a key part of Newmarket's battlefield. It's in the Bushong orchard, it's along the Bushong fence, it's in the Bushong field that the Confederates and Union troops are going to place their final lines of the fight. It's on Bushong land that the VMI cadets will make their charge. Field of Lost Shoes was originally one of Jacob Bushong's wheat fields. So the Bushong family is very connected to the battle, to its history. They were hiding in their cellar during the battle, they took care of the wounded afterwards, and their house, their property, becomes one of those destinations that people want to see as they're returning to Newmarket. Now that continued into the 20th century, and by the 1930s, the Bushongs, they still owned the property, and they had established what was called the Battlefield House. And it was a place where folks could come, they could stay in the old house, they could have dinner. I believe they were paying a small fee for this experience, but they would get to stay on the battlefield and hear the stories from family members who were passing them down through the generations. And again, this is generating interest. The Bushongs are going to work with veterans of the 1st Missouri to place one of the first markers on Newmarket battlefield. So the family remains involved in the telling of Newmarket's story on this key piece of ground that they owned. Now on April 27th, 1942, the Bushong family had to sell their farm. And they sold it to a man named Everett H. Croxton, and he lived in Washington, D.C. Now Mr. Croxton owned the Bushong farm, or what was the Bushong farm, that piece of property, for about 2 years. He hadn't owned it very long before he started getting communications from a man named George Randall Collins. George Randall Collins is a giant in Newmarket's preservation story. In fact, as you drive out to the State Historical Park, which preserves the Bushong farm, you drive on George Collins Parkway. So he is remembered. His name is in Newmarket history. It's even on some roads. It's mentioned in the museums. He did a lot for early battlefield preservation, locking the land so it could be saved as battlefield, interpreted, and studied. So let's talk a little bit about George Randall Collins. Mr. Collins was born in 1890 in West Virginia. He graduated from Virginia Military Institute in 1911, and he went into business venture instead of choosing a military course. Now, he did have military service. During the First World War, he volunteered to serve overseas. He commissioned as a second lieutenant in an artillery unit and actually did see some action in France in the final days of the war. So he goes to Virginia Military Institute. He has this short period of military service in the United States Army. But Collins is very much a citizen soldier. He serves in the First World War, or the Great War as it's sometimes called, and then he goes back and he continues his business ventures, which he had been pursuing in between the time that he graduated and when he went into service for World War I. Now, Collins became a very successful businessman. In fact, he owned 4 major companies, and it was investments, profits from these companies that established his estate and gave him the funds that he needed to pursue battlefield preservation. On August 4th, 1944, Collins purchased what was the Bushong farm from Mr. Croxton, and he purchased the standing farm buildings and 120.25 acres, if we're going to be very precise. So he buys this property, a key piece of Newmarket Battlefield, and then 5 days later he purchases 9 more acres. So he's already starting to add on to his battlefield purchase, if we can call it that. Now, Collins owns the property. He's interested in it, he's studying it, he's fascinated by the story connected, the history connected to Virginia Military Institute and the battlefield at Newmarket. Mr. Collins saves this key portion of Newmarket Battlefield, but it's not long before he has new challenges to preservation, interpretation, and studying this battlefield land. It's during the 1950s that the interstate highway system really begins to be built across the United States. And while it's a wonderful transportation system, it really caused some havoc on some of the Civil War battlefields across the country. And Newmarket was one that was going to have a problem with the proposed route for Interstate 81, which travels in the Shenandoah Valley. Collins and other leaders from Virginia Military Institute managed to work with the interstate highway builders and get them to move some of the lanes a little bit farther east, putting that roadway just a little bit farther from the Bushong house than it was originally intended to be. So even though Interstate 81 literally cuts through Newmarket Battlefield and causes some challenges for seeing it and interpreting it, fortunately, Collins and others were able to make that route, which was pretty much inevitable, a little bit less destructive for the key piece of property around the Bushong farm. During his lifetime, George Collins personally saved 171 acres of Newmarket Battlefield. When he died and his will was opened and read, he had deeded that land to Virginia Military Institute. The following quote comes from Collins' will. He wrote, "I give, devise, and bequeath the remainder of my estate to the Virginia Military Institute, Lexington, Virginia, to be used as a trust to perpetuate and maintain as a memorial of the Battle of Newmarket and to place improvements thereon for educational purposes." So in his will, he gives the land to Virginia Military Institute, and in some ways he gives them a mission statement as well. He says what the land is to be used for. And it's following his death in 1964 that steps are taken to begin constructing a museum on this piece of Newmarket Battlefield. The museum will eventually become the Virginia Museum of the Civil War, very distinctive architectural building, which houses artifacts related to the battle, tells the history of Virginia's war, and also contains special exhibits. Virginia Military Institute continues to maintain the Virginia Museum of the Civil War and the New Market State Historical Park. So the New Market State Historical Park encompasses this land that George Collins preserved. It's the Bushong Hill, it's the Bushong Farm. They now have a tunnel which cuts under the interstate, so you can see some of their property that is preserved to the east of Interstate 81. That area is Strayer Pasture, Bloody Cedars, where the 54th Pennsylvania fought. And then they also have some land that stretches a little farther south toward Manners Hill, kind of in the plateau area. George Collins' footsteps in battlefield preservation and the work that he did in establishing Newmarket Battlefield as a place for study, reflection on leadership, and education also set the stage for other preservation efforts that would happen in the Newmarket area, but ones that have been taken on by other groups. Shenandoah Valley Battlefield Foundation has done a lot of preservation work in the Newmarket area also. I think I told you a little bit about their work at the River Road property when we discussed the history of the River Road line in a previous video. Shenandoah Valley Battlefields Foundation works to purchase land throughout the Shenandoah Valley to set it aside, preserve it from future modern development, develop it into green space that can be used by communities either in a bit of a recreational sense, and by that I mean perhaps walking trails or that sort of development, or purely historical interpretation, depending on what's fitting best with community and preservation needs. Shenandoah Valley Battlefield Foundation has saved significant portions of land, smaller tracts that have come available for purchase around Newmarket, and they are continuing to work on those efforts. They regularly have preservation projects going on in the Newmarket area at this time, so I would encourage you to check their website, and I'll show you that in just a moment if you want to write it down, to see what's going on and see how you can get involved in modern, ongoing preservation. Why does battlefield preservation matter so much? Because it can be really important to go out and see the land. And when land has been developed and then it's tried to be reclaimed, it's even more difficult for historians, for researchers, to get a sense of the land, to get a sense of what happened there. And there is something important, I think, about setting aside land that was battlefields as a place for reflection, a place for study, a place where people can think about the past and hopefully learn from it. When I look at Newmarket Battlefield and its history of preservation, I see enormous success and great triumphs. But I also see areas that remind us of the importance of battlefield preservation and being able to see a battlefield in its, can I say, pristine condition. Battlefields, that might be a strange word to describe a battlefield, because if we think about what happened on this land, it's hard to call it pristine. But yet when we look out across the grassy fields as we see them today, they do look pristine. But I'm kind of digressing from what I'm trying to say here. At Newmarket, we see a key battlefield positions, key tracts of land that were preserved through the foresight and efforts of Mr. Collins. We also see more recent preservation victories that have been attained by Shenandoah Valley Battlefields Foundation. But then we also see reminders of what happens when there aren't preservation efforts. We have Interstate 81 cutting through Newmarket Battlefield. And while it's true that we're probably not going to stop progress, there are sometimes ways that people involved in preservation can work with developers and hopefully find ways that maybe the new development is not going to as harshly impact a historic site. So even though the Newmarket community got Interstate 81 going right down the middle of the battlefield, happily, those who had a preservation mindset, they were able to help position that interstate in a way that was going to make it a little bit less destructive to the preservation sites. There will always be opportunity for preservation of battlefields and historic sites. There's only going to be so much land that can be purchased in relatively its similar condition to the way it would have been during the Civil War period. There's still land like that around Newmarket that is either up for preservation projects or maybe in the future. I would encourage you, if you are interested in Newmarket, to go ahead and follow the current preservation efforts by Shenandoah Valley Battlefield Foundation and keep updated on what they are doing both at Newmarket and at other sites in the Shenandoah Valley. The Shenandoah Valley has some of those lesser known history sites, but some sites and battlefields that are still in excellent, almost 1860s quality of preservation. So it can be important to get those. We're not actually reclaiming land and having to then get rid of the parking lot. It's still the green grassy fields, quite similar to the way it would have been 155 years ago. Well, that about wraps up the little bit of history of preservation, a little bit of thoughts, updates on some modern ways to get involved with preservation at Newmarket. Thanks for listening. I hope you will consider getting involved with those preservation efforts, and thank you so much for watching. There will be one more video in this series on Newmarket, and I will just be sharing a little bit about what I learned, a few experiences of my own with Newmarket's history and the recent book tour. So that video will be coming up soon. But that's going to be all for today, so thanks so much for watching. I'm Sarah K. Byerly with Gazette 66.5. Have a wonderful and inspired week. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.